Thank you, Jared. Indeed, God, I hate sort of introduction when you say you've got somebody who knows what they're talking about. That's a kiss of death before you start, isn't it? And particularly when you gave me the invitation and the challenge was to look at the current outlook, alternatives of what might be coming around the corner as we move forward, and then the impact on the agricultural sector. When this invitation came through, I think it was some months ago, probably 6 or 7, who would have had a clue what was going to go on in that interim, and the election of only 12 days ago. Christ, there's been a phenomenal speed of change and uncertainty. So for me to make any guesses today would suggest this is more a game of chance than anything else. So please take a pinch of salt, anything I'm going to say. I'm also feeling slightly hamstrung. Fiona, wherever she is, greeted me with, you don't mind if this is video recorded and then put online. I realise for your members, Jared, having everything online is really important, but for me it's a bit of shackle, it's a bit of a restraint. I've got to be very careful at times on Turu, because in my AHDB role, I'm actually employed by George Eustace, and again, Michael Gove as well, who was making comments yesterday. So I will be as frank and as open as I possibly can be with you, but please bear in mind that there are some restrictions because of that wretched device at the back. As a light-hearted comment, I did get once caught, and Rob Sheesby in the front will remember this. I once went to a meeting and said, is anybody reporting this? And no one did. And of course, I forgot to ask if anyone was tweeting. And I made some reference to Jimmy Savile keeping us out of the news in a badger cull, and that ended up everywhere on Twitter. And I got the biggest bollocking out when I got back to the NFU press room. But anyhow, one of those things I have to be aware of. The election has changed, I think, a lot, and I will touch on that in a few moments. I was at the Nuffield big conference up in Nottingham on the night of the 8th of June. And when that first statement came out of the exit poll, there was a gulp. You know, was this really what was happening? And we've seen since then the unravelling of different comments, different commitments. And I think it does change for farming an enormous amount, and I will touch on that in the next few minutes. But we're still hearing the same very strong, tough lines from government. Nothing's changed. We are going to leave the customs union. It was banged on the radio this morning. It's amazing how different newspapers report this in a different way. So the Telegraph is saying those lines all remain absolutely really tough, written in the ground. Yet you'd hear the Guardian saying we caved in yesterday, we already realised we've got to change, etc. But the biggest thing, going back to my previous slide, the thing that has changed the dynamics that I think for farming that has come to our rescue is this lady from north of the border riding to our rescue. You go online, Ruth Davison, you go online to look for Google pictures of Ruth Davison, and she's got an absolute myriad. She's either sitting on the barrel of a gun on a tank, or she's dressed up, she's shearing sheep or whatever. She's everywhere. She's absolutely fantastic material to find that sort of slide. But with the number of MPs, yes, with the Scottish Conservatives have, demanding the importance of the rural economy, demanding access to that market within Europe. Whether we keep those words, customs union, whether we keep the word single market, I'm not sure. But I think the language around our access to those markets has changed in a way that we haven't yet, I don't think, started to understand. What the DUP will mean, I'm not sure. If you go online as well, there's plenty of even more light-hearted stuff with Harry Enfield depicting what it's like to be a DUP politician, but I certainly wouldn't want to put a clip of that on the platform now. So I think the election, the DUP, the SNP, the Scottish Conservatives have made a really big difference to all of this. But again, going back to my second slide, a Wheel of Fortune, who knows exactly where this will take you, but I do want to give some pointers over the next 10 or so minutes. The changes started as a farmer. You know, I sat talking to somebody within DEFRA, and he said, we're consulting a lot with farmers, and they seem upbeat. Now, I think we do know that the currency shift for me on my arable business has almost given me, in increased prices, my single farm payment. So you can see why farmers looking at prices today, without the market movements, the currency has given me a big boost to my grain prices, to my single farm payment. We started off being promised a few months of extension of continued support till 2020, and then the election came around and that was extended to 2022. So for me as a farmer at this moment in time, I'm seeing higher prices, I'm seeing the extended commitment to support my farm, and at the same time I've still got access to the single market and the same set of rules that apply to that market. So yes, those things have changed, but for me as a farmer it feels quite good. But I think there is still much uncertainty around. I know from in our part of the world, in East Anglia, there are many people just not even biting at the offer of FBTs. There are contract farmers really asking serious questions about how they plan their business going forward. And again, talking to colleagues who work in the whole supply chain, there are parts of industry really wanting to know that if they employ thousands of people in a meat processing plant, are they going to have secure supply of that production in 5-6 years' time? Or what sort of contracts, what sort of relationships do they need to build with their farmers to make sure that happens? I was with ABP recently, and when you hear of their main meat plants, in the UK, they employ more people than Nissan. No one's spoken to them about a bespoke deal, whereas Nissan were very quickly visited by government to say, what do you need to make sure your investment remains here? But for ABP, other meat processors, they need to know, and I'll talk about tariffs in a moment, their farmers, their producers have got the confidence to carry on planning for the future. And I do think, particularly in the line of business you guys are all in, how farmers consult, plan, look at their structures going forward is incredibly important. We at AHDB have worked really hard, and I would make a bit of an advertorial here. You know, please don't hesitate. Go online and see the whole range of Horizon documents we've done, looking at the trade terms. We did another one last week, which launched at cereals, but really trying to break down all the impacts of different trade deals, the importance of labour, but trying to explain that really important relationship with Europe. And they go into quite a bit of detail around the whole bit of international trade. We've got another one coming out shortly around the WTO, the relationship with third countries, something I want to talk about in a few moments, agricultural policy, how that might look. And again, we did one that I know has been widely picked up around labour availability. Why? Because Jared mentioned it, but as well as being a contract farmer, cereal farmer, I now produce broiler chickens where they go to be processed. 80% of the labour in that processing plant is from Eastern Europe. And you'll see that almost right across the processing industry as you look at the makeup of British agriculture. So the challenge is going to be, and I see the grand promises made in election manifestos. And the point I probably didn't make earlier on, as I reflect on the fact that we are, as farmers, people have promised us money for further into the future. We've got some stability in the short term. We know that there is just a massive debate around austerity, what money we can afford to spend. When we look at the tragedy of last Monday night in Westminster, in that tragedy in the towering tower block, the questions about what we spend our money on, I just don't believe is going away. And when we as a farming industry have recipients getting hundreds of thousands of pounds, this question of supporting agriculture, despite the promises of protecting budgets, is not going away. And I really do believe that we as an industry and as a sector need to be really clear about how we make the argument for support, what's the purpose of it, and not one of special pleading. And I think it's quite telling that this morning when I was listening to the radio travelling down, they were speculating, and then there was some clips from what Philip Hammond has said at the Mansion House talk this morning. It was bizarrely given at a breakfast rather than last Monday. the growth in productivity, the trying to get farming to move forward is absolutely fundamental. If we go to government as an industry and say we want to hang on to the 3 billion, I don't think that sounds very forward-looking. If we go to government and say, actually this industry is going to be an even more important part of the economy, it's actually vital to the fabric of rural Britain, and if you give us the right sort of incentives, we'll be exporting more, we'll be employing more people, we'll be growing, we're producing more value to the economy, but this needs a transition, this needs support to help us invest, etc., then I think that's a better message than saying we need to remain where we are. So, my thoughts on post-Brexit agricultural policy and where we might end up, it is not going to be just the same old area-based payment system. I'm absolutely convinced of that. There's been too much criticism of the current system, of people getting something for nothing or just owning land. This is just not going to, I think, have traction going forward. Again, this is personal views, this is not an HDB point of view. I think the nature of devolved agricultural decision making makes this unbelievably complicated. Even if Theresa May had had a large majority, I think the fact that we had devolved agricultural policy making, this would make it complicated. Put into that mix now that you've got Ruth Davison and Arlene Foster with massive influence, and you've made another 2 more tiers of complexity in how this all unravels. For a English farmer, not wanting to see significant more sums of money going to my competitors around the UK is something that would concern me, but I think all of this is up for grabs. How that common system without the UK works is going to take some real, I think, brain power to find something that doesn't distort markets or get people moving product around irrationally within that UK market. Now, targeted support. I hear in almost every manifesto I talk to politicians, they almost immediately say there's the remote upland areas need more support. You will see certain types of farming, I think, wanting to receive more support from government. So I do see any new policy being more targeted. The point I see probably most of all is the one about being more conditional. And I think this is something that I pick up from both discussions within government, with advisory organisations as well, is that how do we drive the step change within British agriculture? Gerard, you touched on this a bit in the beginning, and I think this is often the elephant in the room, particularly with farmers, because we do love to think that within the UK we are some of the best farmers in the world, that we're doing a great job. The truth is, and I know this is a relative one, and I'll come back to picking up the detail of it, if you look at productivity growth of UK agriculture over the last 20 years, ours has been at 0.3 of 1%, and the rest of Europe's been over 1%, but even those competitors we were lined up against 20 years ago, and we would rate ourselves alongside, like the Dutch, the Danes, the Germans, those guys have kept on going at 1%. And we've seen UK agriculture really tailing off in productivity growth. So how are we going to drive that change through the use of a support system? Are we going to make sure that any transitional payments go hand in hand with some sort of professional cost analysis, benchmarking of farm businesses? If you were in Southern Ireland today getting special support for capital works, it goes hand in hand with making sure you do benchmarking, making sure you do ongoing professional development training. And again, I think we believe at HDB, the amount of money we spend on skills and training in the UK is half what our key competitors would be spending in Europe. So do we say, like the Southern Irish do, the Republic, sorry, do we make those payments conditional on benchmarking, professional development, and then allowing maybe some farmers who want to leave the industry to have access to some money to make that change as well? So I think there is real scope for a debate around conditional of that support going forward that helps the industry, one, understand who it's competing with, but then what it can do about it. And I do think that debate about the traditional support being to create more competitive, sustainable farming sector is absolutely fundamental to that. And that's where I want to go on to a bit more now in the few minutes remaining to talk about AHDB and what we've been trying to do. We've been launching a new strategy document which is really clear about inspiring farmers and growers and the industry to succeed in a rapidly changing world. We know that we've got to think about the challenges of Brexit, but look at our businesses really clearly as individuals. And just before I move on to that in too much detail, let me just put a slide up that talks about how important that EU is to us as a market. I'm not sure you can see those really clearly. The sheep meat is 96%, beef 93, 91 in oilseeds, 82 in cereals, 77% in poultry, for example. This is our main export market, and I suspect whatever the outcome of the discussions that go on over the next 18 months, it's going to be unlikely that we're going to have as easy access, as unfettered access as we have now. But the other bit, and this is why I'm saying this before I go back to the work we're trying to convey to farmers, is those markets are important. But the reason why I think the customs union is now getting massive traction, and on the radio this morning, listening to the aerospace industry, listening to the car manufacturers talking about this continued access to the customs union, is the common external tariff that sits around the European Union today that keeps out products being dumped on the UK market today are enormous. Where we're not moving. Sorry. Right, just to pick a few of those up. Cheddar cheese is surrounded by a tariff from outside the EU of 1,671 euros a tonne. Lamb, 1,713 euros a tonne. Remember that 96% of our lamb goes into the European Union. If we lose that tariff protection, I worry about the lamb industry overnight. I think the lamb, the beef sector, I think the dairy industry is really under pressure. And again, I think the poultry industry, which needs the European market for its dark meat, or a big chunk of its dark meat, is really, really critical. So I think, however we view the future, making sure that our businesses back at the UK are fit for whatever sphere of where we end up. Do we end up with a hard Brexit and we face all of the challenges of being dumped on from around the world, or do we end up with a phased leaving of a customs union, the single market? How do we as farmers look at our businesses? And this is what we launched at Cereals last week, trying to get farmers to broach the subject now. And I realise the contradiction in what I've been saying, that we've had the devaluation of the currency, we've been promised another 2 years of support, we've seen the fact that we've got the access to that unfettered market, etc., etc. But I still think there's so much uncertainty out there. We should, as businesses, use this, what I've talked on other speeches about, use this relative honeymoon period to assess what we can do for our businesses. Are we taking time to review our businesses on a regular basis? Do we know that cost basis? How do they compare? Not just with your neighbours, not with the best in the UK, but our competitors increasingly around the world. I think the one around, and certainly my brother and I sit down, and we've certainly been doing this for a while now, how does our rolling average look? How does it compare? Particularly when you take out the single farm payment. Looking at some of those parameters, if the direct payment, I personally believe when the direct payment is reduced, and then again, what sectors you're involved in, the labour issues, and all of those things. These are just incredibly important questions, and I've just, brother and I, for fear of sharing some of our inner thoughts with you, we just put 250 kilowatts of solar on top of the broiler farm we built last year, trying to set the business up into a whole series of silos that, one, have some synergies and benefit each other across each other, but there's income pools coming in from each. And while we were trying to organise some money to borrow some money for the solar panels, talking to the banker concerned, he said, there's only 3 of my customers who are actually preparing at this moment in time for what life will be like outside the European Union. So I think this message about how we plan, prepare and think about it is absolutely vital, because I think one thing for sure is nothing's going to stay the same. And if something goes wrong in the negotiations, or even in the Queen's speech tomorrow, I don't know what the prospect of a Jeremy Corbyn Prime Ministership would be on agriculture today. So my view is it might look fine and dandy right now, but who knows what we could be facing as a farming industry within 6 months, a year or 2 months. And we all know as farms, it takes time to change direction, to build a strategy and get them in place. So my message is really clear. I don't think we've got time to lose. We need to keep moving on and developing and challenging our businesses. And the point of all of our research at HTB that comes through time and time again is this isn't one single silver bullet that's going to find the solutions. We know that when we look at the very best businesses, it's all about marginal gains. It's the fact that the best farm businesses are often just marginally better at lots of things across the board. How do they pay that attention to detail right across the board in their farming businesses? And it's what we're trying to do at AHDB. We're trying to we've had a big restructuring. We're trying to get ourselves in a position where we are of a real service to British agriculture. I'm not happy, that you mandatory take a levy off farmers' produce, particularly when some of them rant at me and say you're not using it wisely. I think the challenges we're going to face in the coming years, this is really vital, and we do want to make sure that we deliver value for money for levy payers, whether it's driving exports around the world. I think the analysis of what's happening to those markets and maybe some of the implications of Brexit. We have launched a new farm bench. This is not saying the benchmarking that can go on has got to be through HDB. There's a fantastic array of services around the industry. We want to drive farm excellence. We're trying to, again, we have to work to get match funding on some of the R&D spend we get, how we leverage that with the industry. And those 5 challenges I mentioned before, and the skills support to make sure that even if we don't provide it, the industry's got access to that skills and training, which I believe we are still a long way behind in so many others. We've got to be ambitious to having a British agriculture that wants to be the best. And rather than thinking about how do we hang on to support, I think we have to use Brexit to say how do we step change British agriculture, change our ambition to be the best at what we do. A bit about the export work we do, and I think this is something you hear a lot about with government, with Brexit talks at this moment in time. It'll be interesting. I know Michael Gove was on the radio yesterday morning announcing that we can raise environmental standards, we can raise welfare standards, and we can still have cheaper food. I'm looking forward to see the explanation of that. That's going to be quite a challenging one. But you do hear an enormous amount as well, how we're going to export product around the world. This doesn't happen overnight. And I would be really interested, if I get the chance to speak to the new Secretary of State, about how you balance up, this desire to be global exporters, winning markets around the world, with actually the security of those numbers I showed you earlier on, of how important those European markets are to us. But actually getting access, building those overseas markets is massively complicated. Even now, we haven't got a free trade deal with China. We pay the 15% tariff on getting product into there, but the regulatory burden. We at HDB pay 80% of an agricultural attaché who sits in the embassy over there. It takes years. The pig sector worked for 7 years, really, before it had any real traction into the Chinese market. And then you have to work on relationships, and this is just, I do want to stress, slow burn stuff, which we should be putting more resource into now. And something I'd raise as a matter of interest is that the Food and Drink Federation actually advocated in their election manifesto or lobby to government was that we should have a board beer type approach in the UK. The Irish government, the Republic, puts 50 million euros into board beer every year. They have agricultural attachés around the world. They make selling Irish food, their Origin Green brand, a top priority. They never let up. If the Prime Minister's visiting the States, he bangs the drum. If the Agriculture Minister's in China, they bang the drum. They make exporting a morning to night occupation for all their Prime Ministers. If we're going to do what the government talk about, we need to have that amount of awareness and ambition as well. My last slide, Chairman, I think we have to be really honest about where we stand. Let's not use the honeymoon period to think, thank God we got out of jail. I think we do need to look really hard at the options we have as farmers. I think the best thing we can possibly do is make decisions early as farmers, start adapting businesses. The notion that we're going to get single farm payment regardless of whatever we do, I just don't think it's going to happen. And I generally want the industry to be bold and brave. We have to find a way of not being sort of feeling sorry for ourselves, but one that sees this as an opportunity. Slightly naughty, but I do think because of the election, we've got out of jail free on this occasion. We do, I think, have a bit more time to play with, but let's not waste it. Let's get on, revolutionise this farming industry, because I do think when I look at, and being stood here in the Royal, in Cirencester, the university here, I think there's a generation of young people wanting to come and farm that is really refreshing. I'm one of the old gits now, as my children tell me on a regular basis. Let's make sure that we put the right structures in place to make sure we do grab the opportunity, and that isn't doing things the same. That's having a step change, and we all need to be part of that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter. Terrific. Great speech, as always. Now, questions. The other thing I forgot to mention, for those who want anonymity, you can ask questions through the app, and I will get them, and then I'll ask them on your behalf. So feel free, through the app, you can ask questions. But meanwhile, has anyone got any questions for Peter? Because he will be, I think, dashing off fairly promptly after this. One here, and then one here, John, afterwards.
Microphone.
So, Peter, you mentioned...
Peter, please, Christ above.
Targeting of subsidies, and you talked about Ireland, Southern Ireland. Can you expand on that, where you think the target may be?
Look, let me be really clear. You know, when I did NFU, I unashamedly lobbied government. Why? Because if you're Murray Raymond today and you say something that's wrong, they boot you out in February. That's how the system works. I'm actually appointed by government, so I don't want to be seen in any way lobbying, so I really stay away from saying this is what we must do or we should do. But I'm just very conscious from all the discussions I have within government, whether it's BEIS now, because I think the business and enterprise department's been really, really important, and industrial strategies becoming vital. And the whole food and farming industry wants to engage with government on the industrial strategy, which I think is going to remain part of the new government. We basically at HT want to try and provide the tools that help farmers succeed. NFU will do lobbying, but I know from those conversations that the work we do, whether it's in knowledge exchange, whether it's work around skills, getting that information out to farmers, is being viewed as being more critical. So some sort of tie-up between getting money and making sure that you're analysing your business, wanting to improve it, measuring what you're doing, understanding where you sit against the competition. We don't want, you know, I think we've all, certainly me as a farmer, I've been through sitting in a freezing bloody cold workshop on a November morning thinking, what have I learned here? We've got to avoid that. But our growth of monitor farms at HDB recently has been superb. And this farmer-to-farmer learning, which is picked up a bit initially from New Zealand, the Scots did it, and we've sort of quite openly copied that. It's doing some really great stuff, particularly with younger farmers on farms doing farmer-to-farmer learning. And if we want to be the best, we've got to admit we don't know it all. So I think some targeting around not freezing your bits off in that workshop, but doing farmer-to-farmer learning, exciting people about better ways of doing things, is something I do detect coming out of any sort of future programs that could be targeted.
Great, thanks. John Lockhart, and then I have got my first question on an app afterwards.
Thanks, Rashid. Peter, productivity is something that we've got to see improve, but how do we make sure that we don't see environmental damage on the back of that? I was quite surprised recently because New Zealand is often cited as the example of where support was removed, the farmers responded, and they increased productivity. The issue now with Cousins coming over was that they are having to deal with the consequences of massive environmental damage and the costs of putting that right, in particular damage to watercourses and water quality in some of the most pristine habitats or previously pristine habitats in the world is now costing more than the productivity that was done. So it's the question is, how do we make sure that these things go hand in hand? Because I see environmental improvement as an opportunity and needing to work sort of efficiently with production.
Look, and I apologise in the previous question, the second bit to raising our performance should have been around the targeted will be around environmental protection as well. The challenge, I think, is in an austere Britain, and whether that word's now become passé and shunted out the lexicon, who knows. But I do think when we owe 1.9 trillion, we're going to be tough short of money. So how we use whatever sum of money that's allocated to agriculture and the environment is going to be a real difficulty. And what I do know is that we're very quick in the UK to regulate environment protection, and it's a matter of how we get the balance right between regulating environmental protection and how you then incentivise environmental improvement. Look, I've driven down this morning from Bedfordshire. I'm starting to see blackgrass in the Cotswolds, which is, I'm not saying pleasing, because I thought I was the only shit farmer struggling with blackgrass in East Anglia, but look, the countryside looks just amazing. It looks superb. I'm not sure you could wish to drive anywhere this time of year. Early in the morning, it looks superb. How do we make sure that the farmers who do the great work, if we're going to compete with Argentinian beef that's a third of the price of ours, or American beef that's half the price of ours produced on a massive feedlot, we've got to make sure that we look after farmers in some way. But, I just think we'll get regulation. We need to make sure there's some sort of incentive to keep the environmental enhancement ongoing. But, this is a really complex debate. And whatever I've said in the previous 20 minutes, it's not to say that we lay waste to the environment, because that would be tragic.
Right. Questions come in on the app, Peter, do you think tenancy reform has a role to play within agriculture going forward, and the difficulties we face, I suspect?
I should have thought more about this political answer, shouldn't I, knowing the audience here today. I think, look, I do a small bit of FBT, I do quite a large chunk of contract farming. We've looked at two FBTs in the last 2 months, and actually walked away from both of them, didn't even bother to tender for both of them. And then I hear of figures that are absolutely, I think, insane. Absolutely insane. And I'm not sure how you reconcile what people are prepared to pay, how they prepare to cross-subsidise within their businesses, whether they decide that they create a synergy because of the way they're farming alongside a piece of land. And I really struggle to see how we change the mentality without really changing a person's rights to their land. So I read lots of, I think, ill-informed comment about agricultural property relief and how that's causing big wealthy businessmen to buy up chunks of the countryside. When I see business property relief being a part of that, I see rollover, because in my part of the world there's massive amounts of land being sold for building. This is an unbelievably complicated area, and how you get, and this to me probably comes back to more wanting landlords to take a longer term view, to take a more complete view of their land and their land holdings, rather than thinking 220 quid an acre for the next 3 years with, is the right route. Because, when you look at the condition of roads, the buildings, the nutrient status of the soil. You know, how do we farm for the long term? My dad always used to bollock me, and he'd say, look, he said, you go out and party as if you're going to die tomorrow, but you farm as if you're going to live forever. And how do we get that into the tenancy world? I don't know, because at the moment, short-term smash and grab is not the answer.
Thank you. Well, I think if we can draw it... one more quick question if we can. Just there, Rashida.
Thank you, Peter. You've hinted on one of the big issues, as I see it, for British agriculture at the moment, which is competing with countries such as Argentina, where they don't have the same levels of health and safety, welfare, food hygiene to support in terms of the product price that they're looking for on the world market. The WTO appears to favour small nations of that nature, or even large nations, where they don't have the same product. They don't protect countries on the basis of non-tariff barriers to trade in the same way that they do with tariffs. Do you feel that as we are now taking a step outside of the EU, that now is the time to address that issue with the WTO and try and introduce some form of non-tariff, if you like, protection to the point of self-sufficiency within agriculture?
Woo. That's going to be a quick one to finish off with, wasn't it? Look, changing WTO rules is... Look, I'm 57. I wouldn't see them in my lifetime. You know, this is really slow burn stuff. What worries me is people who glibly say we're going to jump out of the EU into WTO rules. They are very clear. You know, the production standards are not an excuse for keeping products out. You know, I would turn the question, and I'm doing this bravely now, bearing in mind the cameras are at the back. You know, how do you have higher welfare standards, higher environmental standards, and still cheaper food? You know, I don't know how you do that unless you potentially shrink our industry to being niche players. Is that the answer we want? And I think when you consider climate change, mass movement of people around the world, the growth of the middle class around the world, if we don't have an ambition to put more British food on more British plates, I think that's a crazy place to be, and we need to find a way of getting British agriculture to do that in a sustainable way. I don't see changing WTO rules as an option, but I do see us trading under WTO rules as a massive threat to British agriculture. Look, I do apologise. I'm going to have to flight away or disappear off in a hurry. Apologise again for the briefness of my visit. But look, I realise as an industry, your interaction with farmers is absolutely massively vital, and I hope you see AHDB as an ally who wants to work with industry wherever possible. So, thank you, Joe.
Peter, thank you very much indeed.